European leaders are in a panic as Trump has the audacity to talk to Vladimir Putin and apparently sidestepping or putting on the back bench Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine as he talks about how in the world he's going to bring the Russia-Ukraine war to an end. Well, we're going to talk about this today with Matthew Hoh. It's been too long since we've had him on here. Matt, welcome back to the show. First of all, lots been going on since we've had you on here last, and it's great to have you back on today.
Yeah, Danny, good to see you. And that was a pretty perfect opening, I think. That was a great statement of what's occurring, 6,000 miles or so from us today.
And, I just frankly, I find it puzzling why there is so much panic or surprise in Europe. When last week's Munich conference, when you had everybody from the vice president to the Secretary of Defense, I don't think the Secretary of State was there, but certainly Keith Kellogg, the National Security Advisor, a lot of people were down there talking to a lot of their European counterparts, but a lot of this stuff has been openly talked about in the Western media. Trump has been saying a lot of signaling well ahead of time where his mind was and all this stuff. So I'm frankly a little surprised that people were shocked by this. What is your thought?
I'm the same way, Danny. Surprised that there seems to be people who shouldn't have been that were taken off guard by it, or surprised, as you were saying, that Trump really means what he says here. Now, certainly you could see the confusion, right? You could see how the details aren't there, how the impulsiveness of Donald Trump, the way that the Americans, one will say something and another one will kind of sort of contradict them. And, you see that it's the outline is very rough about what the Americans want to accomplish, but the intent is clear. And Donald Trump's intent with this throughout the campaign, but then even too, when Marco Rubio took over as Secretary of State, in his first announcement, he said this was the priority of the United States. And we've seen the way that Donald Trump has been going about executing on things, both domestically and internationally. So why the Europeans seem to be, again, caught off guard or surprised is beyond me.
Well, it truly is to me as well. And as you and I have talked about a lot, there's a whole bunch of folks who are antagonistic towards Trump on this side of the Atlantic Ocean and in the United States, and everywhere from John Bolton and quite a number of others are saying, he's. I think Bolton had a statement that Trump had surrendered before he even starts the negotiation, because any talk about bringing this to a conclusion is basically surrender to Putin. Now, right. I think it was yesterday, there was an interview with H.R. McMaster, former national security advisor under Trump in his first term. And he's going to give his view on this, because he's going to be asked again, and I think this is Sky News, so it's from the British perspective. He's going to be asked, what is Trump doing here? And is he basically handing the keys over to Putin? But in his response here, H.R. McMaster, I think, is going to give views to how a lot of people, both in the U.S. and in Europe, are thinking about things. And I think that he's really off base with a few of these, which will then impact how everybody views what happens next. Watch this interview.
Do you think that the U.S. has given up too much before the negotiations have started? Specifically no NATO membership for Ukraine?
Well, I think it's unwise to take anything off the table. So maybe these will be put back on the table. Who knows? But I think what was behind a lot of this, of these seemingly concessions up front, is this misunderstanding of the nature of the war, that Russia actually has aspirations in mind in Ukraine that go far beyond anything in relation to us or what we do. I mean, what Russia really wants to do is to completely subjugate Ukraine as the first step in really shifting the balance in Europe in favor of Russia and, importantly, in favor of this axis of aggressors, which includes another revanchist power on the Eurasian landmass, China, as well as Iran in the Middle East. And I think it's really important for President Trump at this stage to see these connections.
Okay, several things here. I want to get these one at a time. Let's start with one of the first things you said there, was that Trump shouldn't have taken NATO off the table because that'll give him some leverage. But I got to ask, Matt, does it really? Because does anybody in Europe, in the United States, or Russia actually think that NATO and membership is still on the table for Ukraine?
I think, Danny, first of all, let me just say about McMaster's comments, I mean, gosh, how stilted, stuck in the mud, how dependent upon a Washington, D.C., Brussels, London centric orthodoxy of thought is the guy. You know, his inability to see a world aside from that's been ascribed to him, you know, through readings and mandatory documentaries to watch and, you know, and lectures to go to. It seems like it's remarkable how he can't see anything other than the way that, I guess, in an imperial worldview. Or a view from Washington D.C. But yeah, I mean, the idea of NATO being off the table, that's been clear for 3 years now. You know, I mean, this was the purposes of the Russian invasion, which was we're just about a week away from the anniversary of that. So the idea that somehow NATO membership, you know, whether it's actual NATO membership or some type of security guarantee that is just NATO membership under a different name, right? Just semantics. You know, the illusion, or I should say, the delusion to go along with that is really quite impressive. That or anything aside from Ukrainian neutrality is going to be acceptable to the Russians. And I don't see how Russia doesn't just continue going along with the war, just doesn't continue its war if those needs that it's espousing and has been espousing for years aren't met by these negotiations.
And I mean, even looking at from the European side, I have talked to a certain person with who has direct knowledge that even before this war started off, in the behind the scenes in Ukraine and Kiev, that they were told in no uncertain terms by the senior European NATO allies, and then we're talking specifically about Germany, France, and the UK, and presumably the United States as well. Under no certain terms would there ever actually be NATO membership offered, because nobody, why would anyone want to tie their security in the West to potentially go into war against Russia because of the instability between Russia and Ukraine? It was never going to happen then. It's never going to happen now. So for someone like McMaster to actually say, and he's not the only one who said this, by the way, I've seen others say it today, that they think that Trump should have kept that on the table as a way to negotiate, almost as though they think Putin is stupid and not paying attention and doesn't realize that it's not really on the table. Ergo, there's no leverage.
Right. Yeah. If you had kept it on the table, so to say, you would have not had negotiations.
Right.
I mean, like, the Russians would have said, "What, are you kidding me?" You know, Putin and his people would have said, "What are you guys, nuts? Well, let's continue with this war then." You know, and the Russians have been clear about their goals. You know, again, this statement by McMaster and so many others that Russia's goals, and they always personify Russia as Putin, which is what you usually do when you demonize an entire nation, is make it out as to just simply the caricature of one singular man, right? But you know, that the goals of Putin is for the complete takeover of Europe, which is so far from the truth, and so undone by just even a cursory, even a superficial reading of what the Russians have been saying for the past 2 decades, and undone even more by the actions of what would the Russians even want Europe at this point, right? The way the Russians have performed the last 3 years economically, in terms of moving to the east, moving to the south, getting into new markets, building new relationships, helping to grow institutions outside of the hegemonic West, so like BRICS or the SCO, right? I mean, is there even this idea that if everything came to peace tomorrow, if we waved a magic wand, that Russia would want to reintegrate into the West if they could? They may not even see that as being anything that's worthwhile to them any longer. So the whole notion that Russia intentions are to capture and take over and control Europe is just simply preposterous. It's always been preposterous. And those who continue to throw it out as if it's somehow a valid or a real statement, you know, are doing the most that they can possibly, I think, to undermine any efforts at peace.
Well, and the leader on that is Volodymyr Zelensky himself in an interview on U.S. media yesterday. He again said, "Yeah, I think actually Russia is getting ready to invade Poland." He
Yeah.
actually listed them by name that they're going to invade Poland, and I'm just thinking, okay, Russian military, without question, has been growing quite a lot since February 2022 as a result of their needs for this war. But they're getting enough troops right now to, if they need to, conquer all of Ukraine up to the Dnieper River, I think. And they're showing their hand that they're willing to either get it by negotiations or by force of arms if we push it that far. But if they even had the fantasy of going into Poland, I mean, you'd have to have mobilized another probably closer to 1 million people. And unless there's like 2.5, 3 million active Russian troops and all of the kit that goes along with it, then there's not even the prospect that they could do that. Plus, of
Right.
course, then you potentially get into nuclear weapons with that part. And I don't see any evidence that Russia is trying to prompt a nuclear war on itself.
No, it's been their goals have always been clear. A neutral Ukraine, demilitarize Ukraine, protect themselves as they see it from the strategic threat of NATO, whether it be NATO troops up on their borders or NATO strategic missiles. Such as the U.S. missiles in Poland and Romania. Which has always been an argument of mine about Russia's invasion is that, okay, say you're successful, it's never going to do anything about pulling those things out, unless you get to this point that perhaps Donald Trump is trying to get to of a grand deal with Russia to include China that would see the removal of U.S. strategic missiles from Poland and Romania as some part of grand bargain or grand deal. It's certainly the Russians want as the Russians have spoken about strategic talks with the U.S. to include renewing the New START treaty, the only nuclear weapons treaty that's still around that expires next January or next February. It's basically got a year left. They've been clear that they want to have talks pertaining to arms reduction that encompass much more than just New START. So, one of the things I'm optimistic about, Danny, with this is that as these talks begin, beginning tomorrow in Riyadh with Lavrov and Rubio, you have both sides, both leaders basically saying the sky is the limit here. So what may come out of this is much more than simply just a frozen conflict along the forward edge of battle, along the battle lines right now, and it might be something that really could help bring about some degree of stability in terms of the U.S. and Russia long term.
Well, and see, and
that's all it's
that kind of leads to the third thing I wanted to point out from that clip is that he's trying to say everybody's a boogeyman, and in fact, it's this whole axis of aggressors, which he specifically mentioned China and Iran, and he could have thrown North Korea in there because that's the so-called axis. But talk to me if you could about where did that axis come from? Because I don't recall it existing prior to the Biden administration decided to start supporting the Ukraine-Russia war.
Right. This is, we go back 20 some odd years to George Bush describing the axis of evil, right, which was Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. 3 countries that had nothing to do with each other whatsoever. And now we've gone on to this axis of aggressors, if that's what McMaster called it, which includes, the first and fifth biggest economies in the world. You united Russia and Iran with this. They signed last month a strategic alliance, basically, something that if you got back in history anytime in the last 300 years or so and said, Tehran or Moscow are going to sign a bilateral strategic alliance, people would have thought you were just absolutely the stupidest person walking around, but somehow our actions push them together. And you hear McMaster, and this is why I was so, I was annoyed after you played that clip, because what he's reciting, what he's just regurgitating, because these are the talking points that are floating around Washington, D.C. and London and Brussels right now, are the exact if those words become action, are the actions that have led to this point right now. And the idea that somehow doing the same thing is going to be something other than what you've already experienced is, of course, the definition of insanity. And that's what this is. It's an imperial insanity that's occurring in Washington, D.C. And of course, those in Europe who have viewed themselves first among the vassals of the empire, they're afraid they're somehow going to lose out. But the idea that you're going to somehow, by pushing against these powers, not further unite them. And that's what you see possibly with the Trump plan. If it does get to the point that we were just speaking about, where it gets to, was that you would be separating these powers. You would not be further uniting these various nations that have really that the glue that's binding them together are American actions, are American hostility. Taking that away cleaves them apart, separates them. And I don't know why that's so difficult to understand or comprehend, except for the fact that it goes against the narrative of the last decades. It goes against the identities of those like McMaster or those throughout Europe who had this meeting today, right, in Paris, right? That because their identity is one of, we are good versus evil. We are democracy versus autocracy.
Because, and I think also, Matt, that it's just like a hangover left over from, say, the late 1990s, after the USSR dissolved, the Warsaw Pact dissolved, is that we could literally do anything we wanted, and it didn't matter what anybody else said, did, or thought, and they were powerless to do anything about it. And so we got into this habit to where we could just continue to do that. And so it doesn't matter how crazy it is. If we say it and do it, then no one else can do anything about it. It's not 1990 anymore. Now, then you have a situation where you have these rising alternative power centers. And now that with BRICS and stuff coalescing in other directions here, but these guys don't seem to want to get out of that mindset. And so like McMaster there, they want to see this, what he calls this axis of aggression, to be for no reason of our own. They just came up out of nowhere. And, they're doing stuff we don't like. So it must be their fault. And that's what I think the mentality, which is really dangerous, that we're in right now.
Well, they would rather hang on to what they have of the dying empire, right? Of the declining empire. They would rather hang on to that power that they have now, that wealth they have now, right? That control they have now, than ever contemplate giving up the foundations of that. Right. So if you start to talk about multilateralism, you're supposed to start talking about a newer world order. If you start to talk about economic, diplomatic cooperation, coordination, you are giving away those last vestiges of the empire you still have. So for these people like McMaster, or for any of those of them who populate, whatever part of the elite that forms up the empire, why would you give up what you still have? Because the alternative to them is absolute ruin. The alternative to them is that makes you now, McMaster is no longer the national security advisor to the president of the United States, the national security advisor to the emperor. So that now would make him just one of many around the world. And of course, that's something that they can't accept.
And let me just reiterate that point, because it's one thing if it's just H.R. McMaster. That's just one guy. He's got his opinion. He's got a platform, so he can say whatever he wants. But as this report from France 24 today shows the panic that's going on in Paris, and it shows that really the ideas and the mindset that McMaster showed and what you just described are pretty broadly agreed upon.
To put it bluntly, this is the "what the hell do we do now" summit. The Munich conference at the weekend, look, it took 80 years of transatlantic unity, took the shredder and put it through the shredder. European leaders, now not all of them, right? It's 8. It's a core of European leaders who think they can act quickly, getting together to basically say, what can we do to prevent Ukraine from being invaded again? And down the road, perhaps us from being invaded. They're looking at the prospect right now, as soon as this week, of, American officials, Russian officials getting together and basically, as Europe sees it, giving Putin a free ticket to do as he pleases with Ukraine. That means basically stripping its sovereignty, weakening it militarily, keeping control of the fifth of Ukraine they already have, eventually installing a government with a pro-Russian stooge at its head, ousting Zelensky, and carving up spheres of influence between the U.S. and Russia, back to not just the Cold War, but the Cold War sort of writ large.
sending 80 years of everything into the shredder. I mean, this almost just reiterates exactly what you just said, that they have this mindset that we've had in the past, and we don't want to look at a new world. So it's something we need to be afraid of.
I think, and why is that? I've been thinking about this all day, Danny. Like, why aren't the European leaders right now saying this is our opportunity? This is our chance to separate ourselves from the Americans. This is our chance to break away from the American empire, to no longer be the first among vassals, as that guy Ho was saying, right? But to be our own power, right? This is a chance for those who have the idea of a single Europe, right? Particularly those who've embraced for so long now the need for a European Union army, right? That, even if that EU army just comes about because eventually America leaves NATO. So why aren't they embracing that? Why aren't they jumping on that? Some of them are, but like you're seeing with this panic, like, and I'm sorry, I didn't catch who that was who was just speaking, but that panic, the hysteria that's occurring, it's because they know they have nothing. Why does Donald Trump look at Europe and say, there's just not the return on investment here. I don't need my foreign policy to prioritize Europe. I'm going to put Asia ahead of it. I'm going to put the Middle East ahead of it. I'm going to put Latin America ahead of Europe. I'm even going to put the Arctic ahead of Europe at this point in terms of priorities for the American State Department, right? And for the American national security community. And, why is it? And so why aren't these leaders in Europe then embracing that and saying, okay, hey, America, we don't need you. We're going to do this on our own. We're going to finally become the European continental power that we have long wanted to be. It's because they're hollowed out. It's because they have, their economies are weak. It's because their electorates are disorganized and fractured at best. It's because their militaries are incredibly weak and nothing but paper tigers. I mean, this whole beating of the chest by the Brits, that they're going to be, the Starmer being the first one to stand up and say, yes, I will send British troops into Ukraine. You could go, Danny, to not far from you where the Redskins or the Commanders play football, right? You could fit the entire British Army into that stadium, FedEx or stadium or whatever they call it now, right? You could fit the entire British Army into FedEx Field and still have seats left over, right? And I mean, like, so that's the reality, is that these powers in Europe recognize their own weakness. And that's why they would rather be, again, first in the order under the empire. So the top dog under the arm or under the wing of the Americans, rather than see this as an opportunity to cleave themselves a clear and straightforward a separation from the United States to be a power of their own. And so you really see in their hysteria the fear, I think, that they're going to lose out on the benefit of being part of the empire as opposed to being separate from it.
And by the way, that was Douglas Herbert, the international affairs editor for France 24. So he's tied in with what's going on over there. But what do you make of his other comment there that they're, quote, afraid that Trump is going to give a, quote, free ticket to Vladimir Putin to reinvade Ukraine again at the first, and maybe even invade them as well. Now, in the event that there is some kind of negotiated settlement here that Russia can live with, what possible motivation would they have to invade it again later?
I don't think they have any motivation unless they feel threatened themselves, right? So unless they feel the need to restart a preventive war, I don't think they do. And to your point, they don't have the capability or wherewithal to do it. In 3 years of war, they've conquered 25,000 square miles, right? I mean, out of so essentially out of a country that's about 250,000 square miles. And so you're supposed to take them as this great threat that's going to push through, right? I mean, like, against a Ukrainian army that has fought bravely, has fought strongly at lower levels, right? But had inept, incompetent, corrupt as anything leadership, right? I mean, so the idea that the Russians are somehow going to march through Ukraine, and then it's just a question of knocking over Warsaw, Berlin, Amsterdam, The next thing Putin's gonna accomplish what Hitler couldn't. He's gonna cross the channel. I'm sure there's somebody out there saying that today. If we don't, so this idea is simply silly. It's alarmist, and it's meant to try and achieve the political objectives of those in power who, for years now, most especially these last 3 years, where they've used Ukraine as just ember, just wood for the furnace. Essentially, they've used Ukraine for their own political needs, their own political desires, their own political ambitions, including this romanticism, this Churchillian strut, through these last several years, that we need to have Ukrainian men dying en masse for us because it's good politics for us.
Yeah, and of course, it's aside from the immorality of it, it's now having the very impractical result that Russia's stronger than it was, and it is exposing how weak these guys are. Because we talk about incompetent from the Ukraine military perspective, and I've actually articulated some of that in an earlier show today. I suspect that there is probably a lot of that going on inside the NATO militaries, if you get right down to it. But let's hope we don't have to find out on a battlefield.
Well, right, yeah. I mean, watching some of the Munich Security Conference, you see all these generals and admirals in their uniforms, and the collected experience and the competency in that is minimal. It's nothing. For that reason alone, I remember you and I had this conversation probably a year ago now, maybe even longer, about what would happen in an actual NATO versus Russia war. And you could argue it different ways, but one thing that you can argue is the competence of the Russian military. And sure, they've made mistakes, they've had problems, they've had all kinds of issues, corruption as well. But to the point where they're at, where they had the experience that they do have in this type of warfare that nobody in the West has whatsoever at all, is something that you have to respect and you have to pay attention to, but yeah, this idea that somehow Russia is going to push, hundreds of kilometers further west, even to the river, say they go to the river and say they siege the capital, then what does that accomplish the Russians? If anything, that gives NATO and the Americans all the reason they need to fully enter the war, right? Because if you do have that advance, you then have the Poles and the Romanians saying, hey, what about us? Right. And then you do have the urgency, you do have the facts on the ground, if you will, that allow people like Starmer or Macron to say, yes, we need to put a European army in there right now before they go any further. So for just that one singular reason alone, why would the Russians do exactly the thing that would precipitate the war they are trying to avoid? Because this war in Ukraine ultimately comes down to this idea on the Russian side of a preventive war, that we're going to have the war we need now as opposed to the war we don't want later, because we can disagree with it. We can say, no, it's not true. NATO was never going to attack Russia, but that's not the way the Russians view it. That's not how the Russians think about it. I don't think NATO was ever going to attack Russia. I don't. But that doesn't matter. That's not how the Russians view it, based upon their understanding, their interpretation, their reading of history, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and who knows, if we were on the other side of the equation, we might feel differently than we do now. But It doesn't matter, because that's what they do feel, and they have taken action on that. Now, on the potential positive side, Trump was interviewed yesterday in front of Air Force One before he was about to take off somewhere, or actually just before he had landed, I think it was. And he was asked about what his views were on some of these things here. And in the course of this interview, he's going to be also asked about what he thinks the future of Russia may do militarily.
Based on your conversations with President Putin, what do you think he wants ultimately in Ukraine?
I think he wants to stop fighting. I see that. We spoke long and hard. Steve Witkoff was with him for a very extended period, like about 3 hours. I think he wants to stop fighting. They have a big, powerful machine. You understand that. And they defeated Hitler and they defeated Napoleon. They've been fighting a long time. They've done it before. And but I think he'd like to. I think he would like to stop fighting.
Do you think he wants the whole of Ukraine, or just what do you think he wants?
No, I think he wants to stop. That was my question to him, because if he's going to go on, that would have been a big problem for us, and that would have caused me a big problem, because you just can't let that happen. I think he wants to end it, and they want to end it fast.
So I think that's coming after his conversation with Putin, or probably Putin made the comment to him that, which he's been saying publicly for all the whole time, even before the war, that his interest was not in conquering Ukraine. His interest was in security on his western border. And so once he has that achieved by whatever means, there's no motivation for Russia to continue fighting anything at all. So I guess if one thing, there's a little bit of positive there.
Right, and I agree. And he's been saying that, the Russians have been saying this throughout. They give they make last ditch efforts in December and January of 2022 to try and preclude this, to not be forced, if you will, to invade. I know that sounds kind of odd, but and then certainly the whole understanding though of what Russia wants is shown in those first days of their invasion 3 years ago, when immediately after they invade, they start negotiations. I mean, so who does that? If you're bent on just conquering territory and you're just going to have this just simply be a military operation to defeat your enemy and take his towns and cities from him, then why 2 days after you negotiate, 2 days after you invade, you begin negotiations, leading to the Istanbul Accords, right? Which famously were the Ukrainians and the Russians had an opportunity for peace in April of 2022, which is the peace essentially looked like the Minsk II agreements. And the Americans and the British, as we all know, pulled the Ukrainians out of it. Now, here we are 3 years later. The other thing, too, about this is that this belief that the Russians are going to be obsessed with Europe, that might be over. There's nothing to say that going forward, if a permanent ceasefire occurs, there's a peace deal, there's a settlement, so forth, that turns Ukraine into Russia's backyard rather than front yard. There's no reason why, when we look at Russia, we have to say that Europe is the front door, is through the front door of Russia. Right? There's no, and certainly these last few years, the way that Russia has reoriented itself, particularly in its trade and its diplomacy, south or east, there's no reason to think that for the Russians, their front door isn't east now, right? And that their backyard is Europe. So similar to the way that this American administration is viewing Europe as something that the return on investment's not there. Like, it's just not in our priority to prioritize this continent any longer. We only have so many resources, only so many people, only so much time in a day, and we're no longer going to have this as priority number one. We're going to move on. What can they offer us? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's no reason to think the Russians won't do that either. So that you have this possibility then that the Russians, when they get what they want in Ukraine, a neutral, demilitarized Ukraine with a buffer between NATO and the Russian state, that they then continue this forward movement towards other parts of the world, that they no longer see Europe as being their most important engagement, but now they are going to engage with a priority towards other parts of the world, whether it be south towards India or east towards China and Asia.
Well, and I think that Secretary of State Hegseth gave some indicators of that earlier last week, before the Munich summit, when he addressed the issue of whether NATO would even be on the table.
A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0. That said, the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement.
Everything that the United States is saying so far, and that's everywhere from the vice president all the way, or actually the president all the way on down, is that we're looking to minimize our engagement with NATO. We're looking to move some of these things off onto the Europeans to take more responsibility for their own security. We're definitely not looking to add anybody else into NATO, because I think to your point, the U.S. now is, I think, recognizing that the priority is lowering for Europe, and we don't want to increase the cost of that.
Right. And, the Europeans have to be careful not to give the Americans and the Russians exactly what they want, in the sense of causing a stink, being a problem, being the reason for negotiations not to be successful. right? Because that may entail Donald Trump, and the Americans saying, you know what, we had this agreement with the Russians. It failed not because of the Russians, but because of the Europeans and Ukrainians, and we're out. We're done. I mean, it's clear this administration, as again, as rough around the edges as they are, as not as composed and as succinct and clear as their messaging probably should be, that again, they want to leave Europe, in line with what we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes. And so then, the idea of the Europeans spoiling this then, and of creating conditions where out of peace negotiations, we get more war or we get more militarism, is very real. It's very real. I mean, I don't think many people watching think it's far-fetched that, the U.S. and the Russians come to some agreement or some accord, and the Europeans basically say to Zelensky, we can give you a better deal. Similar to what the Americans and the British said to Zelensky in April of 2022. No, don't sign this deal. We'll give you everything you need to defeat Russia, and then you will be the Churchill of your time. Volodymyr Zelensky, this will be the greatest role you ever play. There's nothing to say that these people won't do the same thing again and sabotage this deal, either consciously or subconsciously. But the idea of them throwing Zelensky a lifeline, Zelensky grabbing onto it, is not very far-fetched.
Yeah, not at all. In fact, I want to look at, before I get to, there's something else I want to show you about what Keir Starmer's doing, just trying to lead this effort, which could go somewhere where you're talking about. I want to show you really kind of what started off this whole panic thing, because it was one that Hegseth said a lot of things that got a lot of people, got their eyes open, and they were, uncertain about some things. But when Kellogg said this here about how the negotiations was worked, that's when they really got into a spin.
Can you assure this audience that Ukrainians will be at the table and Europeans will be at the table?
The answer to that last question, just as you framed it, the answer is no. The answer to the earlier part of that question is yes. Of course the Ukrainians are going to be at the table. I mean, it would be foolish to say they wouldn't. But when you say at the table, you have to define it. One of the things I'm driving towards is we've had a good, remember this war has been going on now, we're heading into the third year. One of the things we haven't really gotten to are specifics. What does it really look like? And we talk a lot about it, and I will criticize, and I know I'm being very, very, political when I say this. But President Trump inherited this war right now, but our philosophy is not to continue this war to the death of every last Ukrainian. The intent is to stop the carnage, stop the war, make sure it's reasonable, making sure the sovereignty stays intact. But we're going to get to specifics about it. When you say sitting at the table, in all probability, there's really going to be one of the reasons I'm here is for the input, obviously. But when you sit at the table, there's two protagonists when you look at it, and there's one hopefully to be an intermediary. When you look at
who are the protagonists and who's the intermediary?
Well, I'm saying is it depends. Notice I'm being very diplomatic about it. I got my diplomatic hat, my passport in my pocket. The fact is, we're looking at, you can have the Ukrainians, the Russians, and clearly the Americans at the table talking, but we've got to have specifics to get to a point.
Yeah, so the two protagonists is the United States and Russia. It's not Europe. Europe's not going to be at the table, and they kind of lost their minds when he said that here. But what does that tell you, Matt, about where Trump's focus is, both for this war and even going beyond it?
Well, I think the Europeans were clear in their sentiments about negotiations with Russia, about the need to just continue the war, that the answer to the war is to win the war. I mean, you've seen countless Europeans say this, many Americans too, of course, but those in power, the answer is to win the war. We need to send more money. We need to send more equipment, and potentially the Europeans could send more money. They can't send much more equipment. And if the Americans pull out, that's all that money, roughly half the money has to be made up. The $300 some odd billion spent so far, the Europeans have to make up half of that essentially, as well as the equipment, munitions, weapons, vehicles, so forth. Huge share of that comes from the Americans. So the Europeans would be required to fill that shortfall. But the Europeans have made it clear that that they had no desire to negotiate. And so for them now to say, hey, how come we're not at the table, is just kind of ridiculous. because you said you didn't want to be at the table. We're going to bring you to the proverbial table and give you a voice just so you can contradict us and make sure the negotiations don't actually go forward.
And I think that's one of the reasons why Zelensky is not being offered a table. He's not. He's actually in the Middle East. He's not in Saudi Arabia right now, where some of the conversations are going to start with the United States and Russia tomorrow. But
he's in the UAE. I've got this image in my head of him like looking across the border, right? trying to look across, into Saudi Arabia.
So, but now stepping into that breach there was an op-ed today by Keir Starmer in, I think it was the Telegraph, where he's saying, you know what, I'm ready to send some troops. This is what he said. This is what he wrote, rather. The UK is ready to play a leading role in accelerating work on security guarantees for Ukraine. This includes further support for Ukraine's military, where the UK has already committed $3 billion a year through at least 2030. But it also means being ready and willing to contribute to security guarantees to Ukraine by putting our own troops on the ground if necessary. Now, that's really kind of, I would say alarming, but it's more like weird to me because, number one, the Great Britain doesn't have the capacity to go to war with Russia right now. They just don't have it. You mentioned about the RFK Stadium or whatever, where they in Washington, they wouldn't even fill it. But then also the issue is, why would you want to? Because the Russians have been unequivocal if saying if any foreign troops are brought into Ukraine that are not something that we agree to, and it's under international auspices that we agree to, we'll consider them as enemy combatants, and we'll take care of them just like we do any other combatants on the battlefield. In that environment, why would Britain want to possibly risk war with Russia?
Well, I think Starmer is using a tried and true tactic of politicians who are in trouble, right? He's doubling down on the foreign menace. He's incredibly unpopular in Britain. He became incredibly unpopular as soon as he took office. And right now, he, I think, sees the Russian boogeyman as his way to maintain what little support he has, because his base, as well as maybe some Tories who might vote for him, believe in the Union Jack standing for something on a foreign land. Perhaps that's it. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, it does. I have to imagine his generals and admirals have told him this is just impossible. I don't know if you how you feel, Danny, but I would assume that the British army cannot fight without the American army. Our integrated systems, that the British army has no capacity to fight on their own. So I don't know, it doesn't even seem like a plausible thing to suggest, but I think it simply is just brute, naked, and base posturing by Starmer, as well as I think too, by doing this, so much, right, all the time, it comes back to domestic politics. Donald Trump is disliked in Britain by many who are on Starmer's side of the equation there. And so maybe this is just a way to show he's standing up to Donald Trump, because, this may mean more for the Europeans to oppose Donald Trump than it means to oppose Vladimir Putin. I mean, that's a stretch, but, the domestic politics of this and all, it's important for them to like these leaders that are in trouble to establish some foundation, or at least do something for their base of support. And I think this is why, we talked about this all the last 18 months or so. Why did the Democrats double down on the Ukraine war? It's because the Democrats saw that their base was very supportive of the Ukraine war. The people who were going to give money and go out and canvass for Joe Biden, hopefully Kamala Harris, these are people that were flying blue and yellow Ukrainian flags outside their home. It became a thing of identity for them, right? It became to tell the story of who they were. This is a story of what the United States stands for: democracy versus autocracy. Again and again and again. We've heard that for so long now. And for the Democratic Party in the U.S., it's been 10 years of Russia phobia that has really fed their campaign coffers and made up a huge bulk of their narrative and their platforms. So, very similar for people like Starmer and Macron. They've put so much political capital into this, they can't give it up. It's all they got.
You better watch out. You mentioned the domestic politics. Well, it didn't take long for members of parliament to jump right up and go, yeah, hold on a minute. You're talking about putting British people in harm's way there. This was in Politico today from British MPs. It says there certainly should be a Commons vote. That's their parliament. And after failing in Basra and Helmand, that's in Afghanistan, I would take some convincing, said longstanding Labour MP Graham Stringer. Another one said, involving Parliament in this decision demonstrates both strength and wisdom. This course of action could put UK troops in harm's way against a nuclear power without US support. So they're saying, yeah, let's talk about this through a little bit more. And again, I have to ask you, maybe it's just doubling down. Maybe it's just political rhetoric and they don't intend to do it. But to the life of me, I can't understand why any country like Great Britain or anybody else, frankly, is going to say, I want to risk the lives of my troop, possibly get drawn into a nuclear conflict with the largest nuclear power on the planet for the sake of the most corrupt country in Europe. Make that work for me.
And for the Brits too, Danny, that they just had Brexit 10 years ago, not even 10 years ago, it was 2016. So 9 years ago, they had Brexit. And yeah, sure, there's a lot of regret over that, or buyer's remorse regarding Brexit. But a lot of people still don't believe, a lot of Brits still don't want the British Union to be integrated into the European Union in the manner that many would like to see it. And so again, it comes back to this idea of, is the possibility here for these European leaders to cleave away from the U.S.? And by offering to lead it in this way, is Starmer putting himself in that position where he would be the titular leader of a united Europe, right? Of a grand European power, of a European army. Would the Brits be a part of that? You know what I mean? So I think there's other thoughts here that go beyond what occurs in these negotiations in terms of what the future would look like in terms of powers.
I wonder, Matt, do you think, and I'm asking you to speculate here because I haven't seen any specific reports, but one of the things that Zelensky said in a recent interview was he advocated for the creation of a European army.
Yes.
And one wonders, was he maybe behind the scenes suggesting either Keir Starmer or maybe Emmanuel Macron could be the leader of this European army just to buck up their morale or up their arrogance, so that then they would take that army and come in and help him.
Right. I mean, who wouldn't want to be the man that or woman, because certainly Ursula von der Leyen plays a huge role in this at the EU. Kaja Kallas, the former PM of Estonia, now the European Union's foreign policy chief, huge role in all of this. What man or woman wouldn't want to be the one who separates Europe from the United States and makes Europe its own power, right? I mean, so you can see for the ego how that would be, how that would be something that they would embrace. Shoot, I had another thought and I just lost it. But yeah, I mean, shoot, I've got to throw it back to you because I
right, sorry, man. Yeah, listen, it's just probably just because it's a lot of insanity. It's hard to try to make sense out of things that are irrational and illogical and things that could harm the Great Britain or harm France or harm anybody else in there. It seems like everybody would benefit by getting this war over as soon as possible and then get back to trying to build up. And it's going to take probably generations to rebuild some kind of security architecture where everybody in Europe can be safe and we lower the risk of anybody going to war, as opposed to saying like that headline Gary put up a second ago where Starmer says the quote only path is to give security guarantees to Ukraine for peace. And I'm thinking, no, diplomacy is much preferable to going down a military path that could turn into a nuclear exchange. That's the part that troubles me, is that nobody wants to think in diplomatic terms, anything besides military terms, to try and solve any problem.
Right, and it came back to me. What I wanted to mention was that it does really to carry on with what I had said earlier about how many of these powers are starting to make decisions about what comes next and starting to position themselves or set up the positioning, right, for what it looks like post-Ukraine war. So certainly you have that. And we've seen it before. We talked about this 6 months ago because Volodymyr Zelensky at some point over the summer, and we later found out this was a Boris Johnson idea because Boris Johnson had said the same thing, that Ukraine could fill out the ranks of the European army. That if both Boris Johnson and Zelensky said roughly the same thing, that when the Americans leave Europe, we will be the backfill. Ukraine will be the backfill. So this understanding that this thing is going to come to an end, this understanding that this thing only has a limited amount of time, it's going to have to end one way or another, has been clear to anyone who is willing to honestly appraise it. And even for those who may not want to be honest about it, the reality is for Zelensky and others, we have to find something for us to have. What's going to be our gig going forward? That if the negotiations go forward as we expect them to, and essentially, let's just say the negotiations play out, Danny, where Russia gets the 4 oblasts that they've annexed, the United States retreats, if you will, from Europe. There is not a demilitarized Ukraine and not a neutral Ukraine. But this was the agreement that was made eventually. I know they said no, Hegseth said no Minsk 3.0, but say it's basically Minsk again. And what does Volodymyr Zelensky and his people do to stay in power? How do they position themselves? Where are they going to get the support from to keep themselves afloat? And then for the Europeans, how do they manage all this? And how can they benefit from it? Whether it's individually as institutions, certainly, or individually or as institutions. I haven't seen commentary on what the British Army, the British Ministry of Defense is saying about this, but you have to imagine that there are those generals and admirals within the British military who are delighted at the thought that their PM is willing to say, yes, we'll be the first one in Ukraine, because they see that in terms of bigger budgets, right? And a bigger army and a bigger navy, and so, there are the jockeying that's going around now, that the position that's going on now, I think the statements and the rhetoric and the chest puffing and the posturing, it's all got those purposes just as much in the immediate as it does, or say just as much in the future as it does in the immediate.
Yep, I agree with that. And I also agree with that comment that was just up on the screen, that a lot of this is just the consequence of the NATO expansion, which started back in the 1990s. And, we've got to hear. But anyway, that we'll see what happens with this going forward. We'll certainly keep a watch at it as some of these comments start happening. As apparently there's the first meeting of Secretary of State Rubio and Minister of Foreign Affairs Lavrov in Saudi Arabia tomorrow. There'll be more conversations, and we'll see what else comes out of all this emergency summit, that some of which is still going on in Paris right now, and we'll keep on top of that for you. But in the meantime, appreciate you coming on today, Matt, and giving us the insight into these issues.
Thanks, Danny.
And we thank you guys to be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done that. That helps us a lot more than you think to get the information out there, because we are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, no matter what it is. And we'll keep bringing it to you because you deserve to know. Thank you very much. We'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.